I just finished listening to There Is a River it's about Edgar Cayce. And I wanted to integrate a few of the things that I take away from this and learn from the experience. So, one of the first things I take away is the reality of a fair degree of very precisely accurate psychic information under some situations, under some conditions. The other thing that I take away is the awareness of the unscientific nature of science. And there's an interesting point in the book where one of the medical professionals said, no, we don't want to print this because if it's true, then half of what we think we know and think we knew, we've got to throw out. And this is a very vulnerable thing to do, to throw out things that we think we know and to replace it with the vulnerability of the unknown. To say, yeah, we've got to throw this stuff out, and there's a mystery, and we are not the deity. We are not the king that knows everything, because one of the things that is very political about the presiding deity, be it the Catholic Church or science or anyone else, is that a traumatized population will always gravitate towards familiarity and certainty. And so when you have a traumatized population, which we do, the fear of the unknown is one of the biggest taboos, one of the biggest threats on the horizon, for the simple reason that the unknown represents the probability of re-traumatization. In other words, when you have trauma, which is literally, the most extreme threat to our ego everyday consciousness, the awareness something happened that could be the end of us emotionally, of us socially, of us physically. And the helplessness around that, the fear of that, is such that we will do almost anything to avoid it. And that anything to avoid it includes hanging on to familiarity, even painful familiarity, hanging on to what is certain, even insane, meaning there's all kinds of insanity around us. But we cling to it because it's familiar and certain, not because it's intelligent. And if we understand that the bid for the deity, that to pray and deify in a hierarchy of values, the deity is up at the pinnacle, at the top of the hierarchy. And when we pray, we sacrifice, we make sacred certain things by working hard to see that certain things don't happen that we're terrified of happening, and that other things do happen that we desire. And they often go hand in hand. For example, the deification of money in the United States is linked to the fact that without money, in a materialist paradigm, we lose all value or sense of value, or maybe 80% of the social acceptability and messages of value. We lose that when we don't have money. And so the deification and enslavement and rat race around money is not only the desire for what money can buy, it's also the terror, the avoidance of the terror, that I'm not going to be one of those worthless people in a culture that in its usurious nature, is primarily weighing my value. There's different deities in the culture: sex, power, fame, value by association, make me look good, a sense of security, money. And so we're looking at pleasure, we're looking at a sense of security. In many ways, we're looking for security in our survival, which means familiarity. And in our culture, it's very closely linked to money. And so the fear of not having enough money to survive is a terrifying underlying fear beneath much of American culture. Because when you look at someone through a capitalist lens, what a capitalist asks is, how could you help me in one way or another turn $1 into $10, turn $1 into $2? How can you help with that? Now, there can be direct routes. You can sell me something really cheap that I can easily resell. You can buy something expensive. You can buy my service. You can recommend me to people who buy my service. There's a whole variety of different ways to respond. You can be a sexy object in my life that makes me look good and feel important and feel motivated, and then I'll make more money, or I'll just look better and more desirable to more people. And in a traumatized culture, certainty helps us feel safer, that we will avoid the trauma. And scientists, at a time when very few of us have direct perception of ourselves, of the other, of divinity, of a transcendent state, science offers the promise of certainty that if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. That if it's a thought or feeling that might be unmanageable because it's re-traumatizing, etc., it doesn't matter. It's unimportant. So science offers enormous security as long as it can supply a public with the illusion that it understands things that it does not currently understand. There is no provable scientific theory on consciousness, which is about the most fundamental human experience in the entire history of our species. It's to not have a theory that explains our experience is an enormous hole. And so it plays little games in this effort to create certainty. And so regarding Edgar Cayce's book, it was interesting to watch various scientists come, often incredibly rudely and arrogantly, and try and disprove what was going on, and then go away mostly mollified. It was also interesting to see the sociopathic nature. There's a moment where Edgar Cayce is in a hypnosis state, and he's trusted a friend who is one doctor to protect him. And that doctor has sworn to his wife that she will protect him, because both Edgar and his wife understand the sociopathic nature of the Western mind within a scientific paradigm. And as the book reads, under the violent protests of that doctor, 3 different doctors, one sticks a hat pin all the way through both cheeks, another tries to cut off a nail. And you look at this objectively, and you first of all have to acknowledge the sociopathic element, that here's 4 American men in a healing profession, and there is not one among them, 4 medically trained doctors, not one among them can stop a fingernail being sawn off with a penknife. Hat pins going, pins going in his toes, just to because what's happening in the trance state doesn't fit within the medical paradigm. And it's a very troubling story about our culture in that sense, because I don't think there's that much that has changed, whether it's the CIA giving LSD to unsuspecting Americans, including soldiers, whether it's the CIA smuggling crack cocaine, into black neighborhoods to fund covert military operation. Whatever it is, there's a very sociopathic shadow element within the Western scientific mind that is completely immune from empathy. It is sociopathic to its best parts, its most vulnerable people, the people it is charged to protect, the people that give it the most gift. Because Edgar Cayce, if you look at his 14,000 readings, cured people much more effectively than the medical profession. And so you see the active avoidance of science. So this is, I think, a very important thing to understand, that I understand more clearly as time goes on, about the political nature of science and where that political power comes from. In this case, the ability to provide an illusion of certainty, that the bravado, the instrumentation, the technical Latin terms, the formal education, the extensive vocabulary, the arrogance that says, because I, read this in Harvard or did this or that or the other, it is the way it is, and that's all there is to it. And the collusion around that what it creates is this sense where, in Edgar Cayce's time, it's often men, but in our time, it's women as well, where it's this partnering to create a sense of confidence that answers the fear induced by a traumatized population. Now, it's interesting, as that pattern fits into a much larger pattern. For example, Nixon's aide and advisor in the drug war said that, of course, we knew that marijuana wasn't harmful. Of course, we knew, psychedelics, but we also knew that the resistance to our war platform was mostly coming from groups for whom that would be a possible arena to arrest and disrupt. So in other words, that by making perfectly safe substances illegal, there was a targeting of the more alternative, free-thinking movement that coincided with the anti-war movement, coincided with, feminism and black rights, so that they could be arrested, so that to disrupt the power and solidify the traditional status quo within the American power structure. And what's not caught in a few sentences like that is the trillions of dollars and the trillions of units of well-being that we pay as a price in order to do that. Meaning, as a culture, when we allow a leader to abuse power in that way. There are literally trillions of dollars of lost opportunities, lost well-being, lost transformation. And so we have, for example, more than 2 million Americans locked up. And many of them are for nonviolent drug offenses. And many of those are consuming substances that until the United States declared the war on alternative thinking, indirectly through using fake science to mislabel drugs, such as marijuana is unsafe, and LSD. To give Nixon a very short-term political edge, and of course he was impeached, so it didn't really help, millions of Americans have paid well over $1 trillion to fight this supposed war on drug, which is really a war on people. So, as I read the book and explore, one of the things I see is Cayce's own chauvinism, that he relies on medical doctors more than on his own teaching, despite the fact that he has more information than anyone else, that his teachings, based on the scientific process of measuring results, are actually curing people that in most cases doctors can't cure, or they wouldn't go to a psychic. Most people are much more comfortable going to a doctor. So these are, thousands of people that are healed by working with Cayce that couldn't find relief, working with a doctor. So, I see how slow progress is. I see how backwards it is. I mean, this book has been around for a good long while. But it was also interesting to notice the moment in Cayce's life when he reviewed a person who lived a good long 30 years, wrote multiple books, had numerous examples of miraculous healings, doing the same thing, healing through hypnosis, and finding that the book was out of print, that his son, took several decades to find it, and then, reading that, so in other words, Cayce realized in his lifetime that the cycle of culture and the political nature of science is such that there's no way to penetrate a dogma directly. In many ways, the revolution goes beyond the leadership, beyond the deity, meaning the Catholic Church would never have reformed on its own as long as everyone looked to the Catholic Church to say what's good and what's bad. It just brushed all of its own sins under the table, even in the molestation of young and helpless boys sexually, covered up by the Vatican. The atrocious, unscientific nature of science in some aspects that we see here, covered up. And then covered up that it's being covered up by applying, a double standard. Because anything that fits the theory gets welcomed, and you get welcomed to the good old boys club. But anything that is anomalous gets, hit hard and ganged up on. Well, that's not scientific, that's political. So it's humbling, and I think it's really important that we as a culture deal, in other words, it will not be leading scientists who pave the way into new paradigms of thinking. It will be a population becoming more educated and threatening to leave science behind as a relic, say if it can't grow up, if it can't step up to the plate, that challenges the growth of science. Because as most of the most intelligent people in history will say, is there is no conflict between science and an effective and competent spirituality. There's no conflict between a consciousness that invents science and science that, having been invented by consciousness, turns around and tries to shoot consciousness in the head by saying it's an illusion. It's like, well, if consciousness is an illusion, then science is even more of an illusion, because science was invented as a paradigm from the conscious mind. And it's actually even a little bit more interesting, because René Descartes was visited by an angel who instructed him. An angel instructed René Descartes on how to use his conscious mind to develop science. And science turns around, and rather than being grateful for the opportunity to exist on the shoulders of the other, on the shoulders of the mysteries, on the shoulders of the conscious mind, turns around and says that consciousness is an illusion and that there are no angels, which means that science is a triple illusion, because without consciousness, René Descartes wouldn't have been able to listen to the angel, and without the angel, René Descartes wouldn't have been able to construct the basic ideas of measurements and numbers that form modern science. And so science is really on shaky ground if these two things don't exist. So this is the core takeaway for me around Edgar Cayce, and I hope you enjoy the book.